Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Dialogue. I'm Taimur Shamil. The BJP government contests the elections in India on the anti-Pakistan sentiment, and this has been working out for the BJP government, for the Narendra Modi government for that matter. And that is why we see Narendra Modi, the head of the BJP, and also now the Prime Minister of India, as the Prime Minister of India, because Narendra Modi came as a result of a mandate that was given to him. If we look at his background, the way he became the Chief Minister of Gujarat, and what happened during his tenure in Gujarat would also make us believe what is happening right now in India at the moment. The protest against the Anti-Muslim Act in India, the way people are coming out on the streets protesting against the BJP government, is very evident from by what BJP is doing inside India. While these protests go on, we also have to believe that there is a huge number of people who would still vote for Modi, who would still buy that anti-Pakistan sentiment, who would still buy all the propaganda that we see on the Indian TV channels. Recently, Prime Minister Imran Khan has said that we also expect any sort of misadventure from the Indian side in Indian Azad Jammu and Kashmir. And this statement has a reason, because the Indian ministers and the Indian Chief of Army Staff, they have also given statements in which they have said that while Pakistan talks about the human rights violations in Indian occupied Kashmir, we are now going to attack and we are going to now see for what is happening in Azad Jammu and Kashmir. These these remarks are something very, very important and very serious for that matter. We cannot take them lightly. India certainly perhaps is planning for such kind of misadventure in Azad Jammu and Kashmir. We see line of control being very hot recently, the way India has been showing aggression on the working boundary as well as on the line of control. But why would the Narendra Modi government regime would go for any misadventure with Pakistan? It is a simple reason, which I just said, to cash on the anti-Pakistan sentiment. What they did in Balakot for that matter, and the international humiliation that they invited after doing Balakot is very evident. We all saw that. Today we are going to discuss about Pakistan-India relations and this perception and this realization that India might go for a misadventure. What is the basis of this perception? And also the protests that are going on in India. We're going to discuss about that as well with our special guest in the studios. Our first guest is Ambassador Mohammad Khattak, former senior ambassador, renowned diplomat, an expert on Pakistan's foreign policy. So welcome to the show. Second guest is Air Vice Marshal Ikramullah Bhatti, renowned analyst and expert on Pakistan's national security and politics in the region. So welcome to the show. And we are joined by Syed Muhammad Ali, international relations expert. He's with us on Skype. Welcome to the show, Mr. Ali, for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Khattak, starting with what is happening in India and what Prime Minister Imran Khan has said, that is very important. This perception that India might go for a misadventure in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, how do you see this statement?
Well, there have been, some kind of noises coming from the other side of the border. And there has been a tradition in this region that to divert attention from internal issues, you go for some kind of a foreign aggression, etc., etc. But, well, in this case, I think these statements are a substitute for real action. Because earlier Prime Minister Imran Khan himself had said that India possibly had played its last card. And well, we all know that Pakistan has a strong army, both in conventional terms, in nuclear terms, and any misadventure across the LOC could escalate into a larger conflict, which may not be that good for India as well. So while we should not take these statements of the Indians lightly, at the same time, I would suggest that we don't lose sleep over it. when it comes to, and there's a connection between the internal situation in India and these statements by the Indian Army Chief and by, the other leaders,
Right.
Modi and
The Defense Minister,
Defense
Rajnath.
Minister.
Right.
Nehru, in 1924, in his autobiography, came out with some idea in his in a famous chapter, Paradoxes. Mostly it was about the contradictions in Mr. Gandhi's personality,
Right.
which Beloved would call U-turns, but, well, these had a lot of wisdom.
Right.
But there he says that words like democracy, rule of law, etc., change their meaning when they cross Suez Canal eastwards. Democracy becomes some kind of a plutocracy or a dynastic kind of an affair. Rule of law becomes rule of judges. And the very idea, such
That
ideas,
changes, right.
their meaning changes. What Nehru perhaps was talking about the double standards of the Englishmen, but what he did know, that in India, it will be not just the double standards, but rule of no standards. Double standards are there in politics. But when politics degenerate to the extent that you don't follow any standard, and this anti-citizenship law, frankly speaking, you see, reflects that absence of any standard.
Any standard, and that's very true. That is what is happening in India. It was Mashal Bhatti. This aggression from the Indian side, what happened Balakot, that whole Balakot episode for that matter. How do you see now this statement by Prime Minister that they might go for some kind of misadventure? They have seen that the conventional warfare has not been working out for them, honestly speaking. That's what a lot of people say. What is your take on this?
Well, while we can believe that a full-fledged all-out war is out of the question, but some sort of a misadventure by the Indians cannot be ruled out. And there are 3-4 factors which support this. Firstly, of course, the Indians have found anti-Pakistan or anti-Muslim recipe to be a success in a political victory, as we have seen in the recent elections, that BJP on this slogan alone came out with much greater success than what it had achieved in the previous election. And now that we see that after this turmoil in Kashmir, after having abrogated Article 370 and 35A and locking down Kashmir for nearly 5 months, they've come up with this citizenship laws in which Muslims are being singled out. And it is not just Muslims who are now in protest, but it is the Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, and even Dalits who have come out. And these protests are continuing. Around 27, 28 people have died, and violence has become an element within this situation. And the Indian security forces and the police, they are almost either bystanders or they're supporting this anti-Muslim fervor which has been created amongst the Hindus. Besides that, we find that there are reports that the Indians have removed the fence at a couple of locations within on the LOC. They've deployed missiles over there, and then there are statements from the Indian Army Chief which border on warmongering. So when you look at all this, there's a need for the Indians to once again go ahead with a Balakot type of an adventure, and then they have taken some actions on ground which appear to be preparatory, which are adequate for any person on our side to imagine as to and to calculate as to what the Indians could possibly be up to. So when Prime Minister of Pakistan makes this statement, there is all this evidence available to him. And of course, while we like to caution the Indians not to undertake any such misadventure, having experienced 26, 27 February events, and Pakistan also likes to caution the rest of the world that last time the two countries were lucky that no loss of property or life had taken place.
Or it didn't escalate for that matter.
And that is why it didn't escalate
much.
So if the Indians attempt the same recipe again, and God forbid if this time there is some loss of life or property in Pakistan, then the response from Pakistan would be, of course, far different and proportionate.
The onus would be on India, right?
Yes, and which could be quite painful for the Indians, not physically but even for their ego. And that, of course, may lead to an escalation or some miscalculations which could take the situation out of control.
So who would benefit, let's say, from this escalation? This is an important point. But before that, I would just put this question to Mr. Ali, that while talking about this whole thing that is going on in India, these protests against the Citizenship Act in India, as Vice Marshal Bhatti said, not just Muslims but Sikhs and Hindus have been coming out and protesting against this act. Prime Minister Imran Khan said that the basic idea, if India would go for some misadventure in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, would be to divert the attention from these protests and the way BJP is going for such kind of acts in India. How do you see this whole scenario? Do you see that this is going to divert the attention?
Well, in terms of diverting attention, I don't know, because it seems that after the sort of the attempt to incorporate Kashmir into India, and seeing the sort of within Kashmir, of course, there's restiveness, and that problem has by no means gone away. And it's there are fears that come spring, it's going to start becoming more serious, the situation there. However, on the other side, with the sort of citizenship and the NRC before that, there's a particular context to that. So, if you look at Assam, in Assam there's been insurgency going on, going back to the 70s, and there's this indigenous population who feel that they have been flooded, by sort of the Bangladeshi Hindus and Muslims coming in there, going back to 71. And, the attempt of the state to try and, in a certain sense, appease them, which was not well planned. And they themselves are now, the ULFA, for instance, the insurgent group, has been coming out against, these recent moves, the CAA, for instance. And that's the sort of ironic situation that the Modi government is getting it from both sides. So it's getting criticism, that this is Islamophobic and anti-Islamic, and on the other side, it's getting it from its core constituency and others who feel that this is going to open the floodgates of migrants. And it was trying to project itself, as trying to offer a safe haven to the minorities who are being persecuted. If we look at our side of the border, we can't deny, we have a dwindled size of minorities, and there's no doubt that they are persecuted. So he was, trying to, sort of deflect attention from the, from the Islamophobia, which has been very explicit when it comes to the BJP and its ties to the RSS, etc., to try and portray India as the safe haven for religious minorities. And that, move has backfired on him. So the need for a diversion, they say, there's nothing that gels a country together, and deflects attention from what's going on within a country by turning attention towards the other. And I do also, I'm afraid that, after Pulwama, we were lucky on, on both sides that there wasn't, damage, and there was a face-saving exercise. And, one really fears that because if you look at the larger military doctrine, which is cold start, right, and what the response to cold start is from our end, I mean, that, is of concern not only to us, but, to the international community as well. I mean, in Washington, D.C., whatever conversations are occurring, for sort of South Asian watchers, they are, in the international community, not only there, but elsewhere. There is this concern that now, if there is a skirmish, even if it's for the purposes of deflection, and, if it becomes more serious, because, then there's a fear and a bigger danger here. So, that is certainly an issue of concern, and we need to see, what we can do, in terms of trying to sort of preempt or this threat, rather than just, thinking in military conventional terms. What else can be done to try and sort of highlight our situation, reach out to other sort of, regional stakeholders. So, that's an issue that perhaps we can come back to.
Right. Mr. Ali, we are going to talk about this, what you just talked about, this rise of Hindutva in India, and how this can have an impact on the South Asian warfare for that matter. This is very interesting because for the West, for United States, as you just mentioned, they perhaps would worry about the situation of the minorities over there. But I think the biggest concern for us people in South Asia would be the security of South Asia. If BJP government would use this sentiment, the anti-Pakistan, anti-Muslim sentiment, to justify its aggression towards Pakistan, that can also become a big issue. And how United States, for that matter, has been dealing with India recently, this 2+2 meeting that took place between United States and India, and its impact on the regional security. We're going to talk about this as well after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are discussing the protests in India, this feeling that India can use this anti-Pakistan sentiment to cash on its vote bank inside India is also very significant. It's important. And Prime Minister Imran Khan recently said that India might go for a misadventure in Azad Jammu and Kashmir, primarily to divert attention from the protests that are taking place in India at the moment. And this has a reason, this statement, because in the past we have seen that even before the elections, in that time frame, India went for aggression with Pakistan, and it also saw the humiliation that from the Pakistani side, the way one of the aircraft was downed by Pakistan. And Mr. Khattak, this feeling in the region that also because of the confidence that India gets from the American side to keep a check on the growing Chinese influence in the region, and also the way Pakistan and China are now working on China-Pakistan economic corridor, this might affect India. And they want to use India also against this whole thing that is going on. They might give them confidence. This 2+2 meeting that took place recently, how do you see this and this whole politics that is going on?
Sorry to say, but I don't see things in black and white. Diplomacy is not black and white. Diplomacy is gray areas where you have to probe and find out the real truth or the kind of solution or something. Number one, there are two sides to it. One is exploiting anti-Pakistan sentiment to get votes. The other aspect is carrying out some misadventure. With the first, I agree.
Okay.
With the second, I don't, because India cannot afford that kind of a misadventure.
But they went for this misadventure in Balakot.
Balakot, you see, and they got the answer, and,
Yeah,
and
right.
that again was a, let me tell you, Balakot flying time-wise is only 24 minutes from Islamabad. If they could come to Balakot, they would come to Islamabad also. Why didn't they come to Islamabad? Why they?
Right, right.
So, you know, let's leave it aside. The second aspect is, you see, that when it comes to the US influence, US cannot influence even Afghanistan. US cannot influence even Iraq. US cannot influence even Middle East. US cannot influence, you know, any place, Latin America. US has not been able to influence Southeast Asia. US has not been able to influence South China Sea. US has not been able to influence Germany and Europe beyond a point. And this is what Charles de Gaulle, you know, foresaw in 1960s and early 70s. He knew that what was the kind of the quality of the relations and what kind of, you see, the dynamics were at interplay.
Right.
So I don't think that US encouragement or discouragement is going to make that much difference. Yes, that to Modi can become a sort of a, you know,
Something to show to the public.
Something to show to the public that, listen, even US is not against us, etc., etc.
Right.
But in qualitative terms, there's not much that US can do. And we should not expect that, you see. In qualitative terms, it's going to be Pakistan on strength and weaknesses, which will make the difference.
Irwas Marshal Bhatti, your take on this. This analysis on the qualitative terms is very interesting, that US cannot do much about it, but it is primarily because of our strengths and weaknesses, but also keeping in mind that their urge to go for some misadventure.
Well, you see, whether or not the US can influence the Indians in terms of their behavior towards Pakistan, towards China, towards South Asia or towards Southeast Asia is one question. And second is that, are the Indians willing to go ahead and toe the American line, and toe it to what extent? While the Americans would want it to happen, but will it happen or can it happen? Will the Indians go to that length or not? Because now that we see in the recent weeks and months, South Korea and Japan have cozied up with the Chinese. They have realized that it is in their interest, long-term interest, that they need to now patch up with the Chinese and benefit from whatever China has to offer to this part of the world and the entire world as it grows financially, industrially, technologically, and even militarily. So China is now on the rise, and that time is not too far when it's going to claim the world power status, even at the expense of the Americans. So if South Korea and Japan have realized this, I think the Indians will not be foolish to ignore this, while the Americans would definitely attempt to continue to stick to their position of sole superpower status and continue to challenge the Chinese and continue to attempt to impede their growth, their progress, their increasing influence, not just in the region but the world over. And of course, they do find India as a ready and willing partner which can play second fiddle to the Americans and challenge the Chinese locally. But the fact is, are the Indians willing to do this? Do they see any benefit to them? Of course, the Americans are going to offer a lot of concessions so that the Indians get convinced. But the fact is that the Indians are here. They have a place in this region. Chinese are their neighbor. They have a trade which is almost over $100 billion with the Chinese. And I'm sure their planners and policy makers do realize that the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese is eventually going to be in the benefit of the region, including India. Yeah. So while they may want, they may feel that it is useful to them to continue to benefit from American support and American position in the world, wherein Indians are having a free hand in exercising whatever policy that they want to within their country and in the neighborhood.
Right.
And a latest example is that you see now we have a report coming out about the religious intolerance in which they have mentioned Pakistan and not mentioned India. Which is a direct indication as to how the Americans are trying to encourage or woo the Indians. But the fact is that the world is not blind, and all these activities, all these moves are of course are prompted by the interest that these countries have vis-a-vis each other. And as I said, while the Americans may want to do this, may want to attempt this, but the fact is Indians cannot be so naive not to understand this as to what is good for them in the long run.
But absolutely, that's a very interesting point. But the post-Pulwama scenario, I would put this question to Mr. Ali. In simple words, Mr. Ali, if let's say this misadventure takes place, or if there is this appetite for this misadventure inside India, as Prime Minister Imran Khan said, what is the driving force behind this? What would be, let's say, the driving force behind this misadventure? Would it be a systemic design, let's say, need of the international order at the moment that India wants to work on, or is it a domestic need inside India? How do you see it?
First, I mean, we should think through what what that really means. Because conventionally we do not have the strength to take on India. And I think there's a realization in military doctrine, and India had been thinking that they do, like, if they do an all-out, I mean, not a slight small adventure here or there, but if they try to open on multiple fronts and there's a conventional war, the chances of them coming into Pakistani territory are for international sort of analysts, I mean, they feel that India would be able to do that. And for that, I mean, that's why we sort of went in for the tactical option, nuclear option, which is the smaller bombs. But you see, that's where the situation starts becoming unthinkable. And what I want to point out, so when I was saying the international community, I mean, I don't just mean the US, obviously. And what we need to be thinking of here is not, even thinking about the unthinkable. Trying to think of ways and means in which we can, we can still try and support the Kashmir cause, being strategic without having to resort to the use of force, because that is, the ultimate and, in a very unthinkable potential consequences. I mean, it's easy to say escalation, but what does escalation mean? When one says the international community, I mean, look at the Middle Eastern states, right? I mean, their sort of very lukewarm response to what's happened in Kashmir. I mean, the two states, Malaysia and Turkey, which have been more vocal in their support for Kashmir, did we even go and attend that conference? I mean, we have to also see how we are maneuvering the international situation. I mean, placing all our eggs in the Chinese basket also, as has been pointed out to you earlier, that, yes, there is, the US is trying to use India and bolster India and work with India to possibly counterbalance China, but this is a multipolar world. And, at the same time, India and China do also have a relationship. And on the sidelines of the UNGA, if there's, a rhetorical mention of Kashmir, that does not mean that anyone else is going to try and solve, our issues. But we have to see what options do we have for international pressure. And in the past, the Modi, Modi himself was persona non grata in the US. One other point here, certainly we need to put our own house in order when it comes to the minorities. The report in which Pakistan has been singled out, with the State Department, a lot of people are quoting that report and pointing out that India has not been. But please realize that data on the basis of which this 2019 report is written is for last year. And, last year, if you look at sort of what has happened to the minorities, people, our record on vis-a-vis the blasphemy law, etc., that is why Pakistan was singled out. And next year, certainly, already there is, the international community, the Atlantic, the international media is talking about what's happening in Kashmir. They are taking note of, the CAA and sort of the Islamophobia, overt Islamophobia. And it's not to say that these things, the beef lynchings and the terminology of love jihad, etc., in India was not happening earlier. But increasingly, sort of the gleam of Indian secular democracy is, being tarnished. And as and we see that happening within India, and at least the strength of the movement. The BJP Sarkar is now also unleashing its own street power. But right now we see on the other side, you do see Christians and Jains and Parsis and Muslims and Hindus, coming out together protesting.
Right. Mr. Ali, I got your point, and this is certainly an interesting point how these narratives are being used. And talking about these narratives, Ambassador Khattak, they play a crucial role in foreign policy and also getting the strategic, attaining the strategic goals, achieving the strategic goals. Talking about minorities in India, Saeed Muhammad Ali talked about minorities in Pakistan for that matter. Interestingly, how US is looking at minorities is also debatable. Alice Fields has been talking about when somebody asked her about the people living in India, she said that how do you see people living in China, Xinjiang, and what is happening to them? So the way they play with the narratives of minority rights in different countries, that is very interesting. Pakistan's goal is that we want the world to know what is happening in Indian occupied Kashmir, right? But India wants to divert that attention from what is happening in India at the moment and what is happening in Indian occupied Kashmir. And for that, they can go to an extent, they can go for a misadventure with Pakistan. This diverting of attention and, this whole game of attention, how do you see it?
Look, you must have noticed one thing. Indians' reaction to Indian minorities' voting rights and Indians' reaction to what is happening in Kashmir.
Yes.
On the issue of occupied Kashmir, Indians by and large, made some noises but stayed quiet. On the question of rights of votes to the minorities
Yes.
in India, they are out in the streets.
On the streets, right, right.
So, there's a clear distinction. This shows that Indians perceive Kashmiris as a separatist movement. We have seen that even inside Europe, separatist movements have not been encouraged. Catalans, the recent example. Spain versus Catalans and others, and so. The human rights issue is a fundamental right. But what has happened, you see that this fundamental right has been reduced to only right to vote once a 5 years and right to make noises. When it comes to other rights like economic rights, social rights, gender rights, now we don't see any connection between gender rights and class rights. Gender issue is not issue of upper class women. It's an issue of the lower class women or lower middle class women. We don't see that connection. Similarly, when it comes to minorities, minorities are not only religious, minorities are also ethnic. Minorities are also linguistic. Minorities are, people who have their own peculiarities. And these peculiarities are not in line with the generalities of the overall, country or something. So this, on minorities, the record of the world more or less is the same.
Right.
So I'm rather pessimistic about it. You see that people would care for the few and the majority would sacrifice for the few.
Ewas Mashal Bhatti, your concluding remarks. What are the options now for Pakistan, for if this aggression takes place or the way we are going at the moment?
Well, I think we are following a correct approach wherein we are cautioning the world that India has created this issue within its own country, and in order to divert the attention and in order to gain public sentiment and its support, they could go back to the tried and tested recipe of any adventure against Pakistan. So that they can convince the Indians to exercise some caution, some wisdom, so that they do not undertake this. But this unfortunately appears to be the need of the Indians, and there are indicators that they are likely to pursue this policy.
Right.
But if the world does notice this and intervenes, then I hope the Indians would be prevented from attempting this. And at the same time, I think now is the time that where the world must notice the way the Indians are treating their minorities. And because if it continues like this, then there's going to be a lot of unrest within India, and which is going to affect the bordering countries and of course the region, which of course ultimately will require the attention by the world powers.
Right. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. Ambassador Khattak, pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for joining us. Ewas Mashal Bhatti, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. Mr. Syed Muhammad Ali, thank you for joining us. Pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for joining us. That's all from Dialogue. See you next time. Khuda.